Well, Alco, MFS, Centro Properties and others have already been hit hard by the lack of credit. Many market watchers are predicting that much worse is to come. US banks have written off around $250 billion since the crisis began last August, but analysts from banks such as UBS say write-downs could top $600 billion. Professor Clarke has advised business on issues of strategy and corporate governance, and he says that what we're now seeing in the financial sector is their Enron. I spoke to Professor Clarke a short time ago. Professor Clarke, thanks for joining us on Lateline Business.
Good to be here, Alma.
Now, you say that what we're seeing with the credit markets today is the equivalent of Enron for the financial markets. But Enron was a case of fraud. Are you saying that we're seeing some sort of mass fraud in the global financial markets?
I'm not saying it's fraud. What I am saying is that it's massively incentivised irresponsibility. That's what's essentially caused these problems in the financial institutions.
So massive irresponsibility across the global financial markets?
Yes, but particularly in the United States. The incentives there have been much greater. And here, you know, it's the executives in these financial institutions in the US who are to account for this. They repackage those debts into forms that they could then pass on to others as securities that got reasonable credit ratings. And so the game went on for several years, and now the circus has come to town.
But as you say, we're seeing a whole sector selling complex financial instruments which have been credit rated.
Yes.
So is it a problem then with the ratings agencies or with those companies that are relying on the agencies?
The fault is with the ratings agencies, but they did not originate these instruments. The difficulty is the ratings agents themselves are commercial companies, and the worry is that they've acted on their own commercial interest rather than the, objective information of the marketplace.
So a conflict of interest within the ratings agencies?
Yes, I think so, yes. When the Enron crisis broke, the Attorney General of New York insisted that the investment banks separate out the analysts because the analysts were recommending the investments of the investment banks, and that did occur. Now we have a situation where the ratings agencies have facilitated the banks' repackaging of debt into forms that investors have innocently thought were relatively risk-free, when in fact they're of high risk.
Let's take a close look at some of the Australian companies that are struggling today, Alco, ABC Learning, Centro. To what extent would you say the directors of these companies are culpable, are exhibiting that financial irresponsibility that you're talking about? And to what extent are they victims now of just a global equity crisis?
Well, David Coe of Alco insists that it was a perfect storm which couldn't be anticipated by anyone. But in fact, in each of these cases, the amount of debt that they took on was considerable and beyond what might have been prudent for those companies. And of course, then they attracted in other investors who didn't realise the amount of risk that they were joining.
To what extent should investors be aware, though, of the risks?
I think investors need to be alert, but in this case, because of the complexity of the financial instruments involved and the assurances they were given, they did think that they were involved with far safer investments than turned out to be the case.
With a company like Alco, you're also dealing with a very complex structure. We've been hearing today that Alco Principals has gone into receivership. Is the complex structure itself of these companies a problem?
Well, inevitably, these financial institutions will be complex, but one perceives that some of this complexity is part of a process of concealment, that no one understands the connections involved except the most privileged insiders.
Deliberate concealment?
It may not be deliberate, but it has occurred, and the result is that the processes of disclosure are simply not operating to the degree they should.
Do you see similarities here with the 1980s and, say, the collapse of the bond empire?
Quite similar. It's essentially greed, untrammelled greed, with access to finance that actually will fuel that greed and reward it until the music stops.
Is this crisis as serious?
Oh, it's much more serious than in the 1980s, I think. George Soros has said it's the worst financial crisis in 60 years. I don't believe that is the case, but I do believe that, firstly, the credit markets will not be returning in the way that we've seen in the last few years. and that there will be a lot of financial pain for the next few years in terms of the cost of credit, which mortgage holders will experience and which businesses will find difficult, that they won't be able to get essential credit for their activities because of this irresponsibility we've seen in the marketplace, and now banks simply will not lend. Trust is broken down.
So how far are we through this crisis?
We're really in the early stages. The fact is that no one knows how long it will last, but it's still unravelling and the consequences are still being felt. It is likely that what will occur is the intervention with major financial institutions of the sovereign funds, because it's those that have remained financially strong as the banks themselves in the West have found that they can't offload any more debt and they have great holes in their accounts.
What will it take to solve the current crisis? Will it necessarily mean more regulation? You talked about needing to have people watching the ratings agencies. What are we going to need to see?
Well, I think we'll need some building blocks of better regulation. Firstly, I think patience with margin lending has gone. Directors certainly shouldn't be lending such large amounts as to put their companies at risk if they can't meet the servicing of the debts on their shares. Secondly, short selling is being used recklessly by the hedge funds to actually destabilise companies in the hedge funds' interest, but not in the interest of the economy or the market. That needs some serious attention.
Who can monitor these things, though?
ASIC would be the first port of call, but it may well need a change in legislation too.
We seem to have crises like Enron, as you mentioned, that come up and we don't seem to learn a lot from them. Do you think that we can learn from the current crisis?
We have to. It is slightly ironic that there is a periodic financial or corporate crisis every 5 or 6 years in a cyclical way, but in each cycle we do have to learn. We must learn in these times of recession, but of course also we have to apply those lessons in the times of expansion when in fact regulation tends to slip away because people seem to be making so much money and be so successful that no one questions what they're doing, when in fact that's the very time when these disasters are in the making.
Do you have much optimism that people will actually take notice when they need to?
We'll see.
Professor Clarke, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.